One percenters, welcome back to 1424 basketball training, where the goal is to take 14 minutes, 24 seconds, or 1% of your day to get better. In today's video, thinking basketball, greatest peaks series. Looks pretty long. I just saw a thumbnail, so if you guys are hating on me because of my thumbnail, point taken. This guy has a consistent background or thumbnails. Obviously, I need to put more work into my thumbnails. As of right now, this thing looks long and it looks like a bunch of stuff. So I guess I got to go at least 1.5 speed, man.
The greatest of all time.
Wilt, Russell. So Russell's statistical case over Wilt.
The original GOAT debate captivated basketball back in the 1960s. Back then, the hoops world was divided into two camps. One side argued for Wilt Chamberlain, based on his outlying statistical achievements, and the other for Bill Russell, who collected an astounding 11 championship rings. But what if that whole paradigm is backwards? What if we threw Russell's rings out the window?
I have no idea who the better athlete was. I know Bill Russell did like track, but Wilt Chamberlain was just a monster of a man. In terms of greatest athlete ever, it might be Wilt Chamberlain. So, I mean, he did score 100. Hezzy got a friend of mine dropped 100, but I think in that game there was 4-pointers, but dude could score.
And made the statistical case for Russell over Chamberlain.
There's greater like players, and then there's greater athletes, and then there's greater like team stuff. Like if your team gets more rings, it's very hard to knock a guy who didn't win a ring, but at the same time, you know, you can. You'd have to live in that era.
Who was the best at his best? We started the NBA merger and go through the best multi-year stretches, examining the legends who provided the most on-court impact. These are the greatest.
The best at their best. I never really got to watch too much Larry Bird. I didn't even get to watch a lot of Jordan, just because when he was around, I'm in LA. You don't watch a lot of LA stuff. Tim Duncan watched a ton. Kevin Garnett watched a lot.
Before we dive into specific years and criteria, we'll do that at the end of this episode. Wilt and Russell illustrate something at the heart of this series and basketball itself. In 1962, Chamberlain famously averaged 50 points and 25 rebounds per game.
50 points and 25 rebounds is just stupid.
While playing every minute of every game, it's considered to be the most dominant season in NBA history. I don't think it's one of the 100 best seasons. That may sound crazy, but those 50 points came with a lot of caveats. For one, there were way more scoring chances back in 1962. Teams ran up and down to the tune of about 130 possessions per game.
This is good.
That's about 30 more chances to rack up stats than in a typical game today. More shots, more free throws, rebounds, and so on.
You need context.
Last year. But the takeaway here is that 50 points per game then isn't what we think of as 50 points per game in the three-point era. Maybe the easiest way to see this is to note that Wilt scored about 40% of his team's points that season while he was on the court, whereas Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant scored about 43% of their team's points when on the court during their mega scoring seasons. Wilt also played the entire game, which gave him a few extra minutes of impact, but also made his rate of scoring less impressive. The Dipper scored about 29 points every 75 possessions he played that year, which would rank 7th.
Well, one thing that always has to be taken into account: strategy changes, workouts change, the sport changes over time. Back then, I'm sure there wasn't as many players, so you would just leave Wilt Chamberlain over time. There's no load management. There's no clock. There's no this guy comes in at exactly 8 minutes every game.
But not an historical outline. Okay, but so what you might
imagine if Wilt Chamberlain, did some modern day workouts, Vertimax, plyo bands, all these kind of things.
Wilt still crushed Russell as a scorer, right? And he did. Russell's scoring rate was actually below league average for most of his career. But the question here isn't who scored more points per game. It's how much did these players help their teams score more efficiently. Playmaking is the other enormous driver.
How much did a player help their team score? That's very, 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 very hard to quantify. And if you do, you have to make up some crazy stats to try to measure it accurately.
Driver of offensive impact, making life easier for all 4 of your teammates, not just yourself. And Wilt Chamberlain was the original black hole. It wasn't that he couldn't pass or that he never set up his running mates. It's that he very rarely set them up relative to how much he shot. If we look at true shot attempts, that is, when a player took a field goal or attempted 2 free throws, and compare those scoring attempts to assists, we can see just how little Wilt was playmaking. Here are all the non-Chamberlain seasons since the shot clock.
True shot attempts
per 75 possessions.
True shot attempt, field goal 1. So this is where numbers can lie, where you can make up stuff. And It's just for a general idea. Don't take any of these things way too serious.
Now here's Wilt in the first half of his career. He scored more while passing less than just about anyone ever. And that was a criticism of him at the time. It was common to hear refrains like this from Sports Illustrated in 1966. But the tactical demands of using Wilt to his best advantage, that's scoring, by the way, severely diminish his team's own versatility and generally create more out problems among those who want the ball as much as he does. Now let's go back to that graph.
That's very true, not just of Wilt, that's of everybody.
Create more out problems among those who want the ball as much as he does.
So, yeah.
Now let's go back to that graph and add his 50-point season. It is an outlier among outliers. This has been hiding in plain sight for 60 years. And the names of those who have even gone over 15-1 should drive home just how one-dimensional his offense was. The only players to cross that threshold in the last decade were Brook Lopez in Brooklyn and Kristaps Porzingis in 2018. The takeaway here is that Wilt's sexy scoring numbers were mostly one-dimensional, and there's only so much you can help your team without making life easier for teammates. Because of that NBA axiom, Chamberlain's team's offenses weren't very good during those balls easier for teammates. Numbers were mostly one-dimensional, and there's only so much you can help your team without making life easier for teammates.
You don't just impact your team on the offensive side when you're a goddamn bull or a bulldog or a monster like Shaq or Wilt. You impact the team by actually punishing the crap out of them. You can punish the crap. You can get them into foul trouble. The other four offensive guys can basically stand around and do nothing and then use all their energy on defense. So it's a game, man. It's a game of strategy, and there's a lot of different ways to slice this thing.
Because of that NBA axiom, Chamberlain's team's offenses weren't very good during those volume scoring seasons. They were most efficient in 1962, scoring about 2 points more per 100 than league average. But every other season, they were around average, with Chamberlain registering huge numbers. In 1965, his team had the worst offense in the league by a mile before he was traded, and Wilt averaged 39 points per game on solid efficiency that year. This pattern has actually held throughout NBA history. Huge volume scoring doesn't guarantee a good offense. It can help lift teams to competitive levels, raising their floor, if you will, but there are endless combinations of talent that can make an NBA offense slightly below average, besides dumping it into an isolation score 40% of the time. In 1965, Wilt was traded to the Philadelphia 76ers for their 5th and 8th man, and Philadelphia improved from around 500 play to about a 48-win pace. We don't know how much of this improvement was a much-needed defensive boost, but again, big scoring alone didn't create a good offense. Wilt's team offense has actually improved when he finally shot less. Way less, actually. Few players in NBA history have downshifted so severely as a scorer, going from a shooting machine to leading the NBA in assists. In his second full season with the 76ers, Wilt's scoring rate dropped almost down to Russell levels, and his team's offense exploded.
So this is wild, right? So clearly, when you're the most dominant player, you have to find that balance of scoring and passing. It is a team sport. Players will if you play with 4 bums and you're the best player, they're all going to stand around and watch you. Kobe, Jordan, Iverson, they just stand around and watch. They turned into fans watching these players. And then so when you talk about like dominance and stuff like that, if Wilt Chamberlain probably wanted to score, if Shaq wanted to score on every possession, he could. If Zion Williamson just decided to back down on everybody, he could. Who else? Giannis. Like, certain players are literally unstoppable and can literally shoot the ball at every time. Even Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, like these guys can always get a shot off typically. Maybe not Steph Curry. But like your really dominant physical athletes, they can always get a shot off if they wanted. And it's at a sacrifice. It's always risk reward. And I talk about risk management all the time. Do you jeopardize, would you rather score the 2 points on a fast break on a 2-on-1 or throw it ahead to, your guy who hasn't got a bucket yet kind of thing? There's so many ways to slice this.
Enormous negative correlation between Chamberlain's scoring rates and his team's offensive success. The less he shot, the better they did. That doesn't mean his volume shooting rates.
So like the dominance from somebody to just switch from, the best scorer in the league to the best assist person in the league just tells you how much attention this guy draws.
Team offensive success. The less he shot, the better they did. That doesn't mean his volume shooting hurt his team, but it does suggest that it was holding back his better teammates. Otherwise, why did his coach completely change his style with better players around him? Russell, on the other hand, was never seen as an offensive force, but instead is the benefactor of great teammates. Cousy and Heinsohn at first, then Sam Jones and John Havlicek. But there's an enormous problem with that idea. If there's one thing that hasn't changed in the NBA over the years, it's that most all-star players are recognized for their offense. This includes those Celtics around Bill Russell, and it's often said that his bandmates made Boston a dynasty. But the Celtics weren't actually overflowing with all-star talent then. Here are the All-Star appearances by team during Boston's perfect run from 1959 to 1966, excluding Russell and Wilt. Does any club jump out as being completely stacked with All-Stars if Wilt or Russell would join them? If anything, the Lakers, behind Jerry West and Elgin Baylor, two of the 5 best players of the period themselves, look like the most top-heavy team. If we add Russell to the Celtics, they end up with the most All-Stars, but Wilt's teams weren't lagging far behind. So a bunch of franchises had 2 or 3 All-Star players, typically based on offensive play. And so
All-Stars is kind of like a very weak, cheap, quick way to see how good a team is. Like the current Lakers, you could say they have a bunch of All-Stars, or you could call them Hall of Famers, right? You can market a person in such a way, oh, they're Hall of Famers, but by the time they're Hall of Famers, they're old. Carmelo's old. LeBron is old. Who else on the team? Dwight Howard is going to be a Hall of Famer. He's old. Like you can say they have 59 million All-Stars, like how they do here, and man, they're old. Doesn't mean the team's good.
Russell's supporting cast was no different. It should come as no surprise that Boston's offense was around average or even below average for most of the 1960s. Instead, those Celtics teams won with defense. During Russell's time in Boston, he spearheaded the greatest defensive dynasty the league has ever seen, strangling opponents night after night with a timeless combination of size, speed.
Rules change. Can you win in the NBA with the best defense right now? Oh, it's gonna look very, very different. There's no 3-point line back here. Look, there's no 3-point line. So how do you guard, with a 3-point line if you have Steph Curry out there launching 40-footers, Dame Lillard launching 35-footers?
Boston ultimately incorporated solid defensive teammates to platoon around Big Bill, but he was the driving force behind a club that allowed the fewest points per possession in the league in 11 of his 13 seasons. And while most of the NBA was struggling to reach 50 wins at the time due to parity, Russell's Celtics were an outlier, cranking out 60-win seasons. These circles represent every team's defensive efficiency relative to the league since 1955. The year before Russell arrived, Boston had the worst defense in the league statistically, giving up an estimated 3 points more than league average. With Russell, they jumped to the top of the league and would steadily improve as 1950s names faded and were replaced by stronger and more athletic defenders in 1961. At their peak in 1964, Boston was nearly 10 points better per 100 than other teams on that end, arguably the greatest defensive season ever. As Russell aged and the NBA expanded, Boston remained competitive with its defense until he retired at 35 and then immediately fell back to the pack.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty amazing to see Bill Russell's effect.
All told, Russell captained 5 of the 25 best defensive seasons in league history in a row, an unrivaled team accomplishment. Without a 3-point line and primitive spacing that allowed big men to control the paint as a backstop, a versatile vertical defender like Russell became the game's
primitive spacing.
Boston's ascension to record-setting defense coincided with Russell playing more minutes with a platoon of players around him. At their apex, no other Celtic logged more than 33 minutes per night.
So if there's no 3-point line, every shot is a 2-pointer. You would think that everything, just by, I don't know, common sense, you would try to get closer to the rim. And so back then, all you would really want is rim protectors and really tall, athletic, long guys that can stop shots. So whole different game. If you get that 7-footer out on Steph Curry or Dame Lillard at the 3-point line, Trae Young, it's super hard.
And Boston's final resurgence in 1969.
So you need a whole new defensive strategy that's completely different. You can't just kind of anchor it around one guy as much, because it's pretty easy to get a big guy out there on a pick and roll.
With Russell re-upping his minutes alongside Boston's best offensive player at the time, John Havlicek. Many people talk about Wilt dominating Russell heads up because he scored more than Bill. In their 142 meetings on record, Chamberlain averaged over 28 points per game on 51% true shooting, compared to just 14 points per game on 42% true shooting for Russ. But Russell scored more than Bill. In their 142 meetings on record, Chamberlain averaged over 28 points per game on 51% true shooting, compared to just 14 points per game.
28 versus 14 on 50% man, basically man against man.
2% true shooting for Russ. But Russell's primary value didn't come from his scoring. He won 5 MVPs because he made scoring harder for the opposition, and Chamberlain was no exception. Against everyone else, Wilt averaged 34 points per game on 54% true shooting. So Russell gave him a major haircut, denting his scoring and efficiency. You might think, sure, but Wilt's numbers are still great. But remember, his scoring didn't make his team's offense very potent in the first place. So Russell was blunting what was only a moderately sharp weapon to begin with, imparting that massive defensive impact that drove Boston to title after title every season.
If Wilt Chamberlain can change from the top scorer to the top assist guy, is that really his fault or the coach's fault for just utilizing him as a dummy dunker and just throw it to him and get out the way? Who knows? But if you were smarter, you could definitely develop a big dude to learn how to pass, aka Jokic. So is it really Wilt's fault? Or is it the coach's fault for not really knowing how to utilize him?
Was going on while trying to score in 1962, Russell gave him a larger haircut. In these 75 games, Wilt didn't face Bill. He averaged 51 points per night on 54% true shooting. Against Russell, he averaged 37 points per game on 50% true shooting. That would rank 11th this year in permanent scoring, similar to Paul George in volume and efficiency. If there were stats like opponent field goal percentage in the paint or how much did you hold players below their average, pundits might have viewed Russell's performances against Wilt as being dominant. But those stats didn't exist, so Russell's continued success forced people then to search for explanations beyond scoring. Some people like to credit his intangibles as a leader, and others are more dismissive, looking to his teammates as the reason for their success. We don't have precise measuring tools for that period.
With or without you.
Russell missed between 1958 and 1969. The Celtics played at a 35 win pace without him and a 59 win pace when he played. That's super duper impact, especially compared to the changes we saw when Wilt shifted teams. But remember, these are crude measuring tools. Another more comprehensive approach is to also account for teammates who have gone in and out of the lineup over the years. They're looking at how his teammates impacted teams when they were in and out of the lineup, and so on and so forth. We did something just like this in part 5 of the Thinking Basketball Stats.
I mean, this is sports. I mean, sports debate. You can slip somebody in, you can slip somebody out. You can put, Magic on the Bulls, Jordan on the Lakers. You can switch, had Jordan gone first and all this stuff. You can't just interchange people with numbers. It doesn't work that way. There's chemistry, there's intuition, there's so many different things. There's players that like each other, that play harder when they're together. Like if you've ever coached a team or put in a lineup, certain lineups work better, not necessarily because they're the 5 best players. It's because whatever those 5 guys are doing, they tend to fit a role, whatever weakness the other guy can hide. Like it doesn't work like this, man.
And when we solve this giant equation to estimate a player's overall value,
it's not like pure money ball.
Russell comes out.
That's why, like when the Lakers, they did it before, you try to stack teams. With the Gary Payton, Karl Malone one, like you thought that would be really good. The Nets tried to do it with, was it Joe Johnson, Kevin Garnett, that team with the Nets, the Celtics did it and they pulled it off, but they pulled it off because Kevin Garnett was able to kind of change who he was. Rondo kind of stepped into a role where he became the leader, and then Paul Pierce was a scorer, and then Ray Allen was a shooter. They didn't even like each other. Somehow they made it work. But that stuff rarely ever works. Like building like super teams or whatever, like the Nets are trying to do it again, obviously right now with Kevin Durant, Harden, Kyrie Irving, Blake Griffin. You can say that's like 70 all-stars or whatever.
Noisy calculation. It's possible that in reality, these players could be worth a few points more or a few points less per game, and studies conclude. But consider how amazing this is. The only thing this metric uses is who played and what the score was. And yet, it's top 25 players playing 3/4 of the available MVPs and average 13 all-star appearances per player. And again, it says that when we ignore the box score and focus on the relationship between the scoreboard and the player, that Bill Russell is actually better than Wilt Chamberlain. That's incredible to me, even if it's not a definitive proof. And all of this has significant ramifications for the idea of number 1 options. We typically think about them as the best offensive player on a team, but a great defender like Russell can be the best player on his team by far without being the best or even second best offensive player. This was often the norm before the ABA by far without being the best or even second player on a team, but a great defender like Russell can be the best player on his team by far without being the best or even second best offensive player.
It really determines how do you pick the best player on the team, right? So like I'm a coach, right? So who's going to be my MVP? And it depends on how you want to vote. Like, is it going to be your best offensive player? Is it going to be your most vocal guy that comes to practice every single day and is full of energy and drives the practice and keeps the other players accountable? Or is it, the guy that, gets the most rebounds or plays the most defense or on paper scores the most? I've literally gotten into arguments with parents telling me that their player is the best player. And I'm telling them that no, they're not. Just because they score the most in a game does not make them the best player on this team, because I see these players every single day in practice and what they do and who drives and leads the team. And, I tend to vote my MVP based off of who has quote unquote, like the biggest impact on a team and in terms of like the culture or the style. Not necessarily who scores the most, but who's getting that ball to the score. Like there's so many things. This game is very hard to you know, break down into just numbers. That's why MVP, I say, for the NBA, it's more of a marketing thing. It's like they just got to give it to somebody new to sell more jerseys and sell more tickets and bring eyeballs to a new team or whatever.
This was often the norm before the ABA-NBA merger in 1977, and while it's rare today because rule changes have helped elite offensive players while chipping away at elite defensive impact, Tim Duncan's Spurs, Kevin Garnett's Celtics.
Yes, the rules change all the time. They have to. You're always trying to balance the game between making it too easy because the offense can always cheat. The offense is always pushing the limit. Right, the offense is like the innovators. When I say cops and robbers, the offense is the robbers. They're trying to steal stuff. They're trying to they're trying to make those, you know, swing throughs like KDs. They're trying to post up. They're trying to draw the fouls like Harden, and then they have to make the rules balanced to make the game more watchable as a product.
And arguably Ben Wallace's Pistons are examples of recent teams where the best.
Like, who the hell wants to watch a game that, you know, that I think it was the Spurs and the Pistons, those finals games were in the 80s. Like,
overall player,
Jesus Christ.
Offensive play. If we return to those impact studies that looked at who played and what the
so there is a fine balance between like a game in the 60s and 80s versus a game in the 120s to 140s. I think in the 140s, 120 range, it's a little bit too much offense and there's not enough defense, so it looks like an all-star game. But if it's in the 60s and the low 80s, like around there where it used to be, good Lord, all they're doing is hacking, and you're just, it's hard to cheer. It's hard to watch. It's like a high school, like a low-level high school game or a middle school game where it's like turnovers like crazy, or park basketball.
We see something fascinating. Among the top 20 players, a handful are primarily playmakers, a handful are primarily scorers.
Hey, he's going into my thing. Playmaker, score, snipers.
Another handful are defensive titans. What's
defenders.
That this metric isn't influenced by any of our ideas of
We need some
scoring,
snipers,
second options, or even defense, and yet it's littered with at least 4 completely different types.
Snipers and slashers.
Modern play-by-play data to generate a more stable look at this kind of scoreboard.
And then the showman.
Again, we see the exact same results. It's a
6 profiles
that matters in basketball, and that comes in so many different combinations. In many ways, Wilt and Russell are the original example of this philosophical loggerheads, with Chamberlain bringing offensive and defensive impact, and Russell trying to outpace him, mostly with his giant defensive value. Isolation scoring, like Chamberlain's, can be impressive to watch and helpful for teams starved of scoring threats, but it can also prevent other offensive talents from flourishing in the absence of playmaking. That means I'll be working off the following criteria for this.
Look at the spacing on this play.
Can be impressive to watch and helpful for teams.
So no 3-point line there. All right.
But it can also prevent other offensive talents.
3 guys like within 10 feet. That's terrible spacing. Okay, so now he's out of the way, and now they're pivoting back. Right, that whole other side is completely open if they were to go to, flip it to reverse to a 3, but it's so compact here. So like, the amount of spacing, the amount of kind of type of dribbles that you need. And look at these guys build like long and lanky. There's a very, very little muscular build in there.
First, this series is about basketball impact on the court. We'll contextualize circumstances and philosophies, but factors like aesthetic appeal are outside of the scope here. Second,
aesthetic appeal. I'm glad he brought that up, man. Some things are just nicer and more beautiful to watch. When you watch the dunk contest, typically the more graceful one wins. Like, rarely does the power dunker win. The Dominique Wilkins, the Aaron Gordons, like Jordan wins, Zach LaVine wins, Dr. J gliding, right? You don't care about, oh my God, that dunk was so powerful. For some reason, the more fluid stuff looks, I guess it looks more natural. When I talk about nature, spirals, and fluidity, your eye, I guess, I don't know, it tends to aesthetics.
That means skills that scale up to better teams tend to matter more than skills that can't mesh with other top flight players. Third, we're starting in 1977 when the leagues merged. Well, the game continues to evolve.
Greatest peak criteria on court only, does not factor in aesthetics, cultural influence, innovation, accolades. That's going to be hard to take out. Like cultural influence. How do you take out cultural influence or game influence on court innovation? Like, that's very hard to, how do you just take those things out? Championship, or your mind remembers memorable stuff, and you remember memorable stuff because you made up a story in your head of, where you were, what you were eating, where you were, what bar, I was with my kid, I was with my teammates.
Since the merger, making for fair comparisons.
Overall impact that scaled to better and better teams. That's kind of weird. Off ball value, passing, and defense.
Which will be made relative to the league in a given year. There are no time machines here. Instead, we're trying to understand how much a player impacted the game given the rules and practices of that time. And finally, those peaks must contain multiple consecutive seasons. The key reason for this approach is
impact relative to year. I mean, all of that context is very, very hard to describe to somebody that's not from that time. Just like how, I don't know, 10, 20 years from now, coronavirus, whatever, it's going to be very, very hard to tell someone 10 years that, you know, the kids that are born now, they're going to have no idea. The kids that are born after internet and before Facebook, like they have no idea. It's super hard to get that context around.
To avoid fluky single-season outcomes and to increase the breadth of information to evaluate a player. At the end of the series, we'll revisit how all these guys stack up, but otherwise the episodes will flow roughly in chronological order, profiling the greatest peaks in NBA history. If you're interested in isolation scoring in greater detail.
All right. Well, I mean, that's a great first episode. As a YouTuber or whatever you want to call me, as a coach just running his mouth on YouTube, I can definitely learn a lot. I mean, the production value of this is pretty good. The stats is really, really good. But in terms of basketball, this thing seems like a good talking point for YouTube and engagement and stuff like that. But do I give too much to it? I don't know. I'll be open to see what they produce in the next, I guess, 15 videos. So I'll leave it here. That's more than enough YouTube videos for me for one day. Enjoy your Christmas, guys. Happy holidays, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa. If I'm missing something, forgive me. Happy holidays. Stay warm. It's raining in LA, and stay healthy. Until next time, take 14 minutes, 24 seconds, or 1% of your day to get better. Peace.